I'm speaking to Craig and Cindy Corey, the father of Rachel Corey, who was killed by Israeli soldiers in 2003 as she was trying to protect a Palestinian home in Rafah. Yesterday, they attended the court session in Jerusalem of the Israeli Supreme Court, the oral arguments on their appeal of the dismissal of their court suit. They're presently in East Jerusalem. Good evening.
Good
Hi.
evening.
Now, as I understand it, this is a civil suit. There's no criminal liability involved. Is that right?
That's correct. Because there was a military police investigation in Rachel's case, when it became clear, when it was the position of the U.S. government that there hadn't been thorough, credible, and transparent investigation in the case, the legal option that was available to us was to file a civil lawsuit.
So you filed a lawsuit and it was dismissed, and then you appealed it all the way up to the Israeli Supreme Court.
Yeah, that you said in a very short sentence, but in fact, we filed the lawsuit in 2005. And when you say in U.S. court that it's dismissed, that sort of tells you that nothing happened, but that's not true over here. So it's actually heard, and then after that it's dismissed. So we had the first actual hearing in Israeli courts was in March 10th of 2010. The last day of hearing was in July 10th of 2011, and then the verdict, which dismissed the case, was and with a lot of other information in it, was on August 28th of 2012, and now we find ourselves in front of their High Court or Supreme Court. So it's been a really long process to get to this point, but I think it's been important.
Could you describe the room? How big was it? How many people were in it? And were there official U.S. representatives there?
The Israeli Supreme Court building is in Jerusalem. It's a fairly large, dramatic building, fairly new. I think it was inaugurated or dedicated in 1992. I don't think there are that many courtrooms. I've only been in two. I visited the Supreme Court once before, and the room that we were in was about the same size, much bigger than the district court room that we had. The judges sit at the top of the court. They're kind of elevated, and then there are side pews, kind of where the press sits. I understand if there are prisoners that are brought in, they sit on the other side, and then the lawyers sit in a semicircle in front of the judge, and all of the rest of us, of course, behind. Craig, our daughter Sarah, and I were all in the front row behind our attorneys. Seated next to us was Lawrence Meyer, who is the Consul General for the United States from the Tel Aviv embassy, and with his translator. So yes, there was U.S. presence. We did have a meeting, a very good meeting, I think, with Ambassador Shapiro earlier this week. We wanted to go over with them what we were appealing, what some of the different points were that were being made by the state and so forth, and some of our concerns about those. We felt it was a good meeting, and the U.S. has been represented at all of the court proceedings that we've had.
Okay. Now, and before we go on, what was the name of your attorney?
Hussein Abu Hussein. So he's a Arab or Palestinian Israeli. 20%, of course, of the population of Israel is Arab, and he's represented us in this civil lawsuit from the beginning. It's great.
Okay, to boil it down very simply, at the initial stage, as I understand it, Judge Gershon basically said Gaza was a war zone, and no one can challenge what Israeli soldiers do in a war zone. So if there's blame, it's only Rachel's blame. Is that a fair summary?
Yes. He said that Rachel was killed as an act of war, and really shockingly to us, said that the government of Israel under their law, the way they interpreted the law, or at least the way he interpreted the law. That meant that the Israeli military did not have a responsibility. And in fact, he was very clear in his verdict that he thought that the only person that demonstrated any negligence was our daughter Rachel. In this entire affair, he found that the Israeli military performed perfectly and that the investigative team performed flawlessly. And of course, this is certainly counter to what Craig and I feel, but also the verdict was immediately condemned by human rights organizations, Amnesty International, President Carter and the Carter Center spoke out about it, and how this interpretation of the law would contribute to the impunity that the Israeli military enjoys in the occupied territories. And actually, even Israeli groups like Other Voice, which is a peace group near the Gaza Strip, a lot of the people come from the communities, Israeli communities, that do experience some rocket fire from Gaza, but they have this group that wants to build connections with Gaza, and they also wrote to us immediately after the verdict saying they were in solidarity with us and deeply disappointed by the verdict.
Now, as I understand it, the written arguments were already done, so this was the oral arguments, and then the judge asked questions. And I followed it a little. I was reading the tweets from the Rachel Corrie Foundation, so if my questions are a little weird, that's the reason, because it's kind of fragmentary. One of the things that was raised was damaged evidence, something that was missing or messed up in the evidence. Could you explain what that is?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of things, but that are damaged in that. So when we go back and we talk outside the courtroom, what we're really talking about is a lack of a good investigation. And you may remember that President Bush was promised a thorough, credible, and transparent investigation by Prime Minister Sharon into our daughter's killing. And it's still our government's position that that's never happened. So they continue to ask for such an investigation, for which we're grateful. So when you look at some of the things in the investigation that you find wrong, even when we get to court, it's strikingly, for instance, there was a bulldozer operator, and sitting right next to him in the machine was also a bulldozer commander. They then would have heads a couple of feet apart. They'd be able to see through the windows a little bit differently, but they had dramatically different testimony as to where Rachel's body was after she was killed. So one, the commander said she was behind the pile of dirt the bulldozer was pushing and claiming she'd never been run over by the bulldozer. And the operator said he saw her body where all of the photographs and everything show it really was. So never in the investigation was that dramatically different testimony ever challenged, and never in court. It's as if the judge never heard that were those two things brought together. Other things that came up in court that maybe a little different than that, but seemed really strange to us, is, for instance, the state claimed that Rachel was in a closed military zone. So our attorney says, show me the order. And in fact, they could never produce an order. They couldn't, if you had such an order, you would have to publish it before anybody could know about it. They couldn't show where it had been published. And in fact, the captain for the Israeli military forces that was out in the field in the armored personnel carrier that day, he testified he didn't believe it was a closed military zone. Yet the judge says it was a closed military zone, and so it was illegal for Rachel to be there. That's not quite the damage of evidence, but there's a lot more that goes into that. There's a lot of reasons. We did get more evidence, I think, of what happened when we were in court, because we had an attorney that was able to cross-examine. One of the things that the Israelis brought to court was a videotape they'd taken for the border. Well, it was slightly different than the tape they'd released to our family and the U.S. government before that and to the rest of the world. It started immediately when Rachel was killed, and it went for about 12 minutes after that. And they claimed in court that there was no other tape that existed. This was the extent of it. And it's astounding to me because at that time, when we were in court that very day, in the text here in Israel, there was a film documentary that included the tape from before those minutes. And yet, they never came back. They just continued this fiction in court that there was no more tape. And I think in the United States, for instance, if any attorney had heard that accusation that there was more tape, and somebody said, well, you can see it in the Cinematheque, they would have gone out, found out about it, and they'd been furious because you would be disbarred by not bringing all that evidence into court in the United States. But here, it just went right through. So there's a couple of examples about that. But we did say that.
I'd just like to add that as I understand it, we're arguing legal points at the Supreme Court level, and the facts of the case can't really be argued here. And something that's rather disturbing to me is that the judge determines the facts of the case. So there's one judge, no jury. He listens to all the evidence, and he more or less chooses what pieces of it to accept and not to accept. And as Craig pointed out, he determined, along with the state, actually took all of their positions, but determined that there was no other tape. And amazingly and disappointingly to us, that there was no relevance to tape prior to when Rachel was killed. We know that the bulldozers retreated to the border. The activists thought that they had been successful in possibly preventing a demolition that day, and that then the bulldozers came back again, and that they had received orders not to let the activists interfere with their work. So it seems to us that what happens prior is very important, what the audio communications are, what the video is, and so forth. And I'd also like to say one other thing, and that's that the lead investigator, Shalom, testified that it was his personal opinion that they were at war with everyone in the Gaza Strip, including the peace activists. So to me, and I think to most reasonable people, that would right there put into question whether this could be a valid investigation.
All right. One other thing that seemed to me came up yesterday was this question: if the military saw these foreign activists as causing problems, why didn't they just remove them? Just say, either leave or we're going to remove you. Right. What was the colloquy about that?
The state persists, and they did during the district court hearing too, in saying that there was no way to do that, even though there is in the log a statement about that they had previously, with another house, successfully removed the activist and then demolished it. And this is an operations log that was kept of what the unit was doing. They talked about it being too dangerous for him to exit. But of course, any of us who have been in Gaza know that soldiers did come into Gaza, did go into houses. It seemed to me that if there was the will to remove people, and that this was not, I want to remind people, this was not when there was a lot of action going on. And in fact, the state kind of seems to want to have it both ways, that it's a war zone, and at the same time they want to say that they were not doing anything but routine activity, bulldozing, clearing that area that had already been emptied of houses to make sure there were no explosives in the area. It seems to me they certainly had methods. We tried to point those out in district court testimony, ways in which they could have removed the activists. I think some of the most, damning testimony is that the commander on the ground that Craig referred to earlier testified that he had asked for the operation to stop because he realized that it was dangerous for the activists. This guy was in the APC vehicle. They had a manual written that was written after the start of the Intifada. Parts of that were released before our trial started from the Supreme Court. And it was for how these machines were to be operated during limited conflict. And it was written specifically for the beginning of the Second Intifada. And it said that if any person came within 5 meters of the bulldozer on the sides or 20 meters in the front, that the machine should stop. And of course, all day activists were getting much closer to that. That was being violated constantly. And then you have the operations log in which the deputy battalion commander, who from afar was directing what went on that day, he wrote into or dictated into the log after Rachel was killed that he knew that this incident would be troubling in the media to their reputation and so forth, but that it was important not to set a precedent for the foreigners by stopping the operation. So there was a mentality of we're going to continue no matter what, and that was the directive that those soldiers on the ground received.
He also added in that log right after that the shoot to kill order for that area had to be maintained. So so every adult that went into that area should be shot. And it's just extraordinary. I was a Vietnam vet. You don't just go around shooting people. I'm sorry. And of course, not long after that, that little 13-year-old girl was shot by the Israeli military. A captain went out and emptied his pistol into the chest of a little girl. And
I remember.
Yeah.
And we also, of course, have James Miller and Tom Herndal, who both ultimately died within that same 2-mile stretch. At least one of James Miller was it happened under the command of the same person who was in charge of the Gaza Strip when Rachel was killed, Pinky Swartz. He testified in court. And that was within a 7-week period, 3 internationals in that area. So something was very much amiss.
Now, I know it's not a great sign, but were there any questions that any of the justices or judges asked you that gave you hope that they might decide in your favor?
I think, we may have different opinions. I think, like our Supreme Court justices, I think the procedure was kind of the same, where the attorneys make some statement and then the judges jump in with questions. I think they do a very good job of not really indicating so much, how they're leaning. And of course, again, it was being translated to us, but that's not the same as understanding the Hebrew. And so I think our lawyers are better than we at indicating, in replying to a question like this. But from what they told us, they were very pleased with the questions that were asked by the justices. They felt that they indicated that the justices had read the briefings that had come to them for the appeal, that they were addressing the legal issues that we hoped they would focus upon. I don't think there was a real clue as to what the outcome will be.
Emotionally, I think when you're watching and our attorney goes first and you see the questions which are probing, it feels kind of bad. And then you see that it's just equally as probing when the state's attorney gets up there. So it's pretty hard to read those tea leaves.
The one discouraging thing that our attorney, Hussein Abu Hussein, pointed out actually in the brief was that the rulings by the Supreme Court, I believe since 2010, have been discouraging on this front. I think of all the cases that have been brought, only 2 were actually, did they find with the people who brought the cases. It seems that the decisions have been very much in favor of the military. And I know that there are many people here who feel fairly skeptical about the court and concerned about the decisions of the court. I understand that there are previous people people who are on the court that have felt a lot of concern about the direction. But I think we have from what I can tell, what I've been told, we have a good panel of justices, and I just, hope and want to believe that they will look very carefully at this and realize that certainly the decision that Judge Gershon made about what happens during war, and this being an act of war, that this is far-reaching. It's beyond Rachel at this point. It's another decision where it will impact all human rights observers, media, NGO people. One of the things that the state argued was that Rachel was not covered by international humanitarian law because she was not a resident of the occupied territories. She was simply there at the time as an outsider. If that stands, that puts, NGO folks that go into Gaza and the West Bank or work there at risk as well.
Well, my last question, I'm going to leave the courtroom, go to the theater. As you know, Ashley Malloy in Connecticut is going to do My Name is Rachel Corrie in Hartford, and I understand in Jaffa you attended a play, the play. How was that? What was the crowd like?
It was wonderful. Yeah, the actress is very talented, and it of course was in Hebrew. And so it attracted mostly a Jewish Israeli audience, although there were some Arab Israelis there as well. And it was done to show solidarity with our family as we went to court. But it did that, but it did it in a way that really brought Rachel into this part of our lives. So when you're in the courtroom, it's about Rachel, but Rachel really isn't there. It's so confined that there's nothing about our daughter that really comes out of that. But in the play, there she is, and we talked to the actress afterwards, and she sort of wondered what we thought and if she got Rachel right. And part of me said, I said, you don't have to get Rachel right. It's like any other play. You have, you read what Rachel wrote and then you bring it through yourself. But I said, you had me when at the very beginning, she turns on a light as if she's in bed by pushing on it with her toe, and she's just fumbling around. And I said, you had me when you turned the light on. It was just delightful and so warm. And the actress got, I think, 3 curtain calls, maybe 4. Oh. So, it was just a wonderful night.
I think it was a very different experience for us than seeing the play in other places. The audience, it was full of Jewish Israelis, although one of the first people that came up to me was a young boy from the Galilee, Palestinian, and he was a teenager and so excited, and he talked to me outside the theater before the play began, and he said, I just had to come here. I just feel like I'm holding on to a piece of Rachel right now, being here with you. It was very moving. And also Israeli Army Radio was there, a young soldier, reporting about this. Also a young person from Israeli Army Radio at the court yesterday that we talked with. And I actually appreciate those opportunities, to be able to share our point of view with folks. It was a full theater. It was packed, and there was a panel after with human rights attorney Mikhail Svard moderating, and we had Sir Michaeli from B'Tselem as well. So it was an opportunity for people to hear from our family, from Sarah was there, our daughter as well, and also to hear about the situation for human rights observers in the region.
As we close this, going back to what I was thinking of is that the actress playing Rachel said that she had some Jewish Israeli young women come up to her after the play and say, I wish I could have been Rachel's friend. And I think, that's a lovely thought. And it's a much better thought than anything that's going on in court, I'm afraid.
Okay. Well, I understand you have no idea when the court verdict will come down. Could be a month, could be a year. So we'll keep in touch and hope for the best.
Thank you
Sam.
so much.